Here with Jason Bell, Assistant Director, Player Development and Minor League Coordinator for the Astros. Fundamental coach, I think, is part of your title as well, but started with the Astros in the Quad Cities and then have worked your way up, but started on the college side and played at SLU in Central Missouri. And Jason, you and I go way back, so thanks for jumping on with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me.
I think you were one of the first guys to jump from the college to the pro side.
Yeah, it's like looking back, it seems kind of like, pretty normal nowadays, but I feel like, in the 2016, 2017 range, it wasn't as common, especially for those who didn't play professionally themselves.
I mean, what was the? I mean, you're making a run at the college side. What was it? Okay, I'm going to jump over to the pro side.
I actually really liked coaching in college. I even liked a lot of coaching at the junior college where, there's not as many restrictions and you can practice as long as you want. And it was, very baseball specific. But, I felt like, had interned at Baseball Info Solutions, which is now called Sports Info Solutions. And I started to, kind of start digging through the data a lot more and, trying to see how you could connect a lot of that with player development. And I could kind of see that a team like the Astros were interested in looking at it from that regard. And I think just some of my ideas and passion for it and what I can do with people, I think maybe garnered up their attention a little bit.
With baseball info, what was some of the data that you were looking at? Or like, okay, this makes some sense from a player development standpoint.
So like looking back to this, 10 or so years ago, it was a lot of does the shift work, and that was like one of the debates. And here we are next year where they're outlawing it. But at the time, part of my job was to just chart a lot of games, chart positioning, what's happening when the ball is put in play. And I just kind of started to see like some trends I could see that the Astros were shifting the most. And even though they didn't have the talent to win a lot of games at the time, you could kind of see that what they were doing was working. And from that regard, it got me like to start thinking of things in a different way. And when I think about positioning, I think back to that point of time where I had a bunch of people debating if it even works or not. And I thought it was pretty clear that it does. You're going to put the guys in the spot where the balls hit the most and have proof of it. So that's kind of where it started.
And then is that the impetus? You write a 17-page paper on how to help the Astros. Was that how that all started?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I had Tommy John, and so I didn't really anticipate having an extra year of college, but I was finished with my classes. So I wanted to try to keep playing, and so I did a 2-year master's degree in 1 year, but I had to have an internship to get the degree. So I went to Baseball Info Solutions and I started like looking at all of these things and I was like, how could I turn my final paper into something that would help me in my career instead of it just being like an assignment of a summary of what I was doing. And I figured too, if I want to work in professional baseball and I'm not a professional player, how would I possibly show somebody that like I could provide value? And so it was really the Astros. I felt like they were being pretty overlooked because they weren't producing wins on the field yet, but I could see that like, some things were coming. They were drafting some really good players high up. And I felt, maybe this could be something down the road. Cause, obviously at that time, all I had was a college playing degree or playing career and one master's degree. So I went through the college game and kept like kind of sending my paper and not really hearing anything. And then maybe once I got enough like coaching experience is when they felt like I could potentially add some value.
How was it working through the Tommy John process?
It was interesting. I think that really helped shape me as a coach, ironically, because that was the first time I had to really think about like viewing practices from another lens outside of mine as a player. And it was towards the end of my college career. So I was looking to want to get into coaching anyways. And so I remember my very first practice, like being able to not participate. And I always loved practicing and like, all the details of a practice. And I remember thinking like, what am I going to do for like a year just sitting here? And then I remember like the second practice, just kind of going up to the coaches at Central Missouri and asking them, is there any way that I can chart or do anything that would be of resources. So I did a lot of that through the scrimmages and such, and I tried to feel like I was like a low man assistant coach on the totem pole, and I like to just even hang in the cage and just watch those guys, attack certain skill development. And I felt like that was the first time for me that I was like viewing things like a coach might, and I felt like that got me experience through a very difficult time.
I mean, how important is it for a coach to stay with their players that are banged up? I think sometimes they forget about them. How important is that to stay with your guys that are banged up?
Oh, it's very important, and it's tough, right? Because especially at the Division II level, where you don't have a ton of coaches, and you have 35, 45, some places even 50 players. It's hard to give everybody the attention that they need. But I think there is the way that you can do that, and I felt like the coaches there always were very good at that, and made me feel a part of it. And so that was really really awesome. And I'd never really been injured before inside of baseball, so it was a good challenge for myself at like how to motivate myself and stay on myself. So it was a lot of good things that kind of set me up, for life after playing baseball. And so I think that in the end there was a lot of positives inside of a negative situation.
Did you pop in game or was it during practice?
It was kind of like a build up, and then actually in summer ball, it just felt like the year before the velo was down a lot, and just kind of was building up, and it just kind of like had some tingling feeling, and so it just kind of came out, not really thinking that it was anything crazy, and it was basically like seemed like it had been torn for a while, but not completely torn, and that was kind of the end of that.
Hey, this is a gaudy stat, by the way. Astros are the only team in MLB history to hit 100 win mark 4 out of 5 seasons.
Yeah,
I mean, how
it's
gratifying is
crazy.
that for the organization?
It's awesome. It just speaks to like the whole entire organization too. I think sometimes scouts don't get enough love, but at the end of the day, like everybody, from the recruiting world, you gotta have the good players first, and I think it's just a awesome group effort, and been really awesome to be a small part of it.
What was the most eye-opening thing for you when you got to pro ball from the college side?
Uh, there's a lot. It's interesting. I would say how much it's even changed from my first year. Like my first year, my job as a development coach was to add a lot of wearable technology to players and try to get the buy-in from them. And thinking back to the 2017 season, that was actually pretty difficult compared to what it is now. And so I think changing some of the mindset around how development would be viewed was probably the most difficult part at first, and then really just like trying to find a way individually for each of them to understand and back behind it, because at the end of the day it was going to be utilized for their benefit, but it wasn't always viewed that way from the player's perspective. And so I think that was probably the most challenging thing up front in the beginning, and it's been cool to see how it's grown and what it's done all across the industry, really.
Well, and you knew it was going to take some time, but now that the younger generation of baseball players are more comfortable with the tech piece, it just filters its way up because they're more comfortable with it. And then I mean, you're talking about when you got into baseball info, you're probably handwriting stuff or tracking it, but now you
Yeah.
have Hawkeye. That
Yep.
that makes things a lot easier too because you know how people are moving on the field, you know where they're out on the field. That makes things easier, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I always look at it as like we're trying to maximize time. And so instead of like charting and doing all these things that eat up so much time, if that can be done for you, it's just going to maximize our utilization of time as a coach to better suit the player's overall outcome of their careers.
I mean, you got a young coach right now that's thinking about trying to jump to the pro side. I mean, what are some things they maybe need to dive in right now to help them get an opportunity?
I think first it's like where can you add value? What is something different that you could provide an organization? And like, for example, for myself, it was like, I didn't play professionally, I didn't speak Spanish. Like what could I possibly bring? And so that was where I kind of started when I was writing my paper and thinking of different ways that I could add an impact. And I think a lot of people understand the tech now. I think a lot of people know how to communicate with players, but like, how do you prove that and show to the organization that you could give them something that they don't already have?
Do you have to have a social media presence now to get your foot in the door?
No, not at all. There's actually plenty of coaches that we have inside of our organization that like don't even have social media accounts and things of that nature. But it is interesting because it is a way to showcase yourself, from afar.
Can you move up quicker in pro ball than on the college side? I just saw that you had 20 MILB staff members that have had time with the big league staff since 19.
So it kind of depends. I think sometimes it's right place at right time. That could be college or pro, and you know, sometimes on a college staff there might not be. If you're a volunteer assistant, there might not be any movement from the two assistants for decades. But maybe after your first year as a volley, there might be. So it kind of depends, and same thing inside of professional baseball too. And I think it comes back to if you're doing a good job, people will notice. It will take care of itself, and the path will be created that way.
And you did a little bit of everything coming up through on the college side too. But your last stop, you're pitching coach with Maryland Eastern Shore. I mean, does that piece help that you've had your hand in a little bit of everything, working your way up?
Yeah, I definitely think so, especially because, when I went to college, I was more of like a shortstop who couldn't hit. So I just became a pitcher, was very raw. And so, I think coaching in college and doing a lot of different things really helped prepare me in the professional game where I probably spend the most of my time by far just working with position players. But just the fact that like I've had some pitching coach experience and was a pitcher in college, it does make me think about things maybe differently than others would. But it also made me have to spend a lot more time understanding position players more and going to the depths and such to just to make sure that I was up to speed and ready for a role like this.
When you say up to speed, I mean, what were things that you needed to get caught up on?
Like I think when I first became, development coach and I'm working with defensive players mainly, it was just learning a lot of the intricate details about maybe infield defense or outfield defense, and also creating my own viewpoints. And, I felt like there's a lot of different opinions on certain techniques. And it just took me a little bit of time watching videos, asking a ton of questions, talking to a lot of different people to kind of garner up my own viewpoints of maybe how to train defenders and kind of from that regard.
Do you ever get to put it down? You ever get to you get to catch a breath every once in a while?
I don't know. It seems like not really, but it's like I almost look at it as like a lifestyle. It's not really like a job, especially being like a single man. It's just like, I wake up and this is kind of on my mind, and it doesn't really feel like I'm working ever. And so that's always a positive thing about the whole situation.
I'm the same way. I don't view it as work. Like I'm passionate about it, so I just don't. It just seems like there's
Yeah,
going to be like microdosing pieces of it every day where you're not getting away from it too far because it just one I don't want to like I want to stay involved with it as much as I can because I love it.
exactly. Yep.
With the best players that you've been around, I mean, what does separate what those guys moving up and maybe making it to the ones that maybe don't? Besides talent, I think obviously you got to
Mhm.
have some talent, but what separates the ones that ultimately get there and the ones that don't?
I don't necessarily think that there's one exact area or one exact way. I've seen it a few different ways. But like when you think of a guy like Jeremy Pena, since the first day he was drafted, he just goes about his business completely different. Even stretching and catch play, and if you watch him 5 minutes before first pitch of a major league game, just the way that he's going about his throwing program in the outfield for a couple minutes, and just the attention to detail that way. I would say from the S&C side, I think is extremely important and maybe an area that's still a little bit overlooked in terms of connecting what you're doing off the field in the weight room and nutrition wise with your goals on the field. And I think that that's how you would be able to maximize your career the fastest, because I think that that's where you're going to probably see a lot of things change on the field that start in the weight room.
Did he get to spend much time with his dad? His dad's a good big leaguer. Did he get to spend much time with his dad growing up?
Obviously growing up and such, but his dad kind of lets him lets him go about his business, in his own personal style,
We
and
went to Maine,
it's
right?
awesome. Yeah, yep. He was born in Dominican, grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and went to the University of Maine.
Coach Trimper.
So it's a pretty cool story.
It is a very good story because I think that comes with former big leaguers too, because we've recruited. I'd recruited some former big leaguers' sons. I don't think the big leaguers care where their kids go as long as they're going to get treated all right.
Yeah, and just as long as they get a chance, and to see what kind of happens.
Is there a barrier of entry to get into pro ball now as a player?
In what way?
In any way? I mean, what's going to discount? I mean, okay, so here's the basement. Like, here's where you have to get into. Like, this is what you have to even get a chance.
It probably depends. I think on the pitching side, it's maybe a little bit more specific. Like you probably either need command, velo, or stuff. Or any combo of those. On the position player side, it can be a little bit trickier because it's probably not as clear. On the amateur side of what exactly can produce. What exactly a major leaguer maybe looks like at that side. And so I think it's not as clear, but it can really depend on the individual's attributes themselves.
When you're talking with your players, do you talk defensive efficiency much with them?
Yeah, we actually make a huge ploy in terms of defense, and I think one of the areas is what position you play on defense actually matters how much you have to hit or not. If you look around the league, you like everybody goes through a slump at some point. But if you play a high level of defense, and by high level, like better than league average, then you just give yourself a chance to not hit and still be successful, or to go through a rough patch and still find yourself in the lineup. And so, I look at it this way: like if you get a roughly 4 at bats a game and you get a hit a game and maybe a walk, on defense you maybe get a couple balls hit your way. But when you think about it, it's roughly the same amount of impact that you could have on defense as offense, because you're not probably going to get a hit every time. So if you're only getting one hit a game, but you're getting multiple balls on defense, who's to say that defense isn't as valuable or more as offense? And I think kind of looking at it from that lens has kind of shaped my viewpoint a little bit differently. And just in terms of, you don't see a whole lot of players go through the same types of slumps on defense as they might offensively. So it always just kind of provides you a super high floor if you value the defense, have a process in place, and can continue to grow.
Yeah, that's the separator for me. You guys finished third in the big leagues for defensive efficiency, so that's converted outs that are put in play. Everybody strikes out so much now that you can take fielding percentage and throw it out, because there's a team that's going to lose 100 games probably that might field 988 because of the amount of strikeouts. And so defensive efficiency is much – you look over the last 10 years, usually the teams that are there at the end are in the top in defensive efficiency.
For sure. And if you think about it, like if you're one of the best hitters at your position that you play, but also the worst defender, you're still only breaking out roughly even, depending on which way you look at it. And obviously there's a DH position, but not everybody. And the league average OPS for a DH is going to be much higher than it would be from a center fielder who plays good defense. And so just in terms of providing value to your organization and your team, it really does a lot of times come down to what position you play and how well you can play it.
Hey, MLB threw a pitch clock at the minor leaguers after spring training. How are you helping the pitchers get adjusted to that? Because I saw minor league games that first week, and it didn't seem like anybody really missed a beat with the pitch clock.
Yeah, I think our pitching coaches did a good job towards the end of spring training of like putting that into part of their bullpens and the games. And I think from that standpoint, it was a little bit easier of a transition. And I think too, inside the games, the clock is like so much in your face that like as a pitcher, you kind of start to figure out fairly quickly of like how much time you have. I think it just on the pitching side comes down to, how can I utilize my time in between pitches more efficiently? And I think that was kind of the struggle early on.
You think it was harder on the hitters because they didn't have much time in between pitches?
Yeah, I would say that it was much harder on the hitters that, people maybe didn't think about as much because they have to be back in the box so much quicker. And, if they felt like they made a bad swing or, there was a bad call that didn't go in their favor, they didn't have a whole lot of time to then step out, look for a sign, and get back in the box. And I felt like that definitely hurt the hitters. It kind of forced them to be sped up a lot in the box.
Do you feel like the hitters are finally getting caught up to the stuff that they're seeing?
I don't know. I think it's all relative, and I think as I've seen over the years, I'm always like, how do hitters ever hit this?
Yeah.
And then every year you start to see the guys kind of adjust and adapt to it, and it's interesting to see like, will people throw much harder over the years, and will people be able to hit it? Will there be nastier stuff? And I think it's all just relative because you're just taking the best players in the world against the best players in the world, and I think that there will always be some level of competition that they're able to figure out on the other.
I feel like this is a great time to coach because we are allowing players to be more individual with their movements and how we're handling that piece.
Yeah, and I think in terms of individual, it can go much deeper than just even like their mechanics in the box or whatever. It could be even be their throwing program in the outfield from a position player standpoint. It could be, their exact plan, before the game, prep work, and even inside of Mass Fungo. And, I think that it can just go to the depths and depths and depths that we're starting to see. And it's really cool for the players because at the end of the day, it's just we're trying to produce the best versions of themselves. And how do you do it inside of a team setting? I think we've kind of always trended that way, but it's been cool to see the evolution of some of that in recent years.
I mean, how are you getting pro ball is such an individual thing? How are you helping them figure out that, okay, hey, there's an individual component of this, but there's also a team component of this as well?
Right. Yeah. And I think it starts with like, okay, what's the long-term goal of the player? Like they want to be a major league player, but I think sometimes when they're in low A, it seems so far away. It's hard for them to really think about being a major league player when they have four levels first. And so I think it starts with their like the long-term goal that I almost view as like a dream. It's like, all right, that's just so far away. Let's like hone it into where we are now. And I think a lot of times if you are producing your individual goals, then you will also help your team win. And so I think a lot of times people ask in pro ball, like, how do you balance development versus winning? I think if you're developing, you will also win, because if you're trying to get more sweep on the slider for the pitcher, he's probably going to strike more players out, which is going to help you win the game. Now, there always sometimes can be like, okay, well, maybe he's going to walk a little bit more players or, things of that nature. Or maybe you're trying a new position with a defensive player that's going to, create more errors and such. But at the end of the day, a lot of them go hand in hand where, if you're developing the player, you will also win games. And that's kind of the way that I look at that.
I mean, do you guys track minor league win losses for your franchises in the minor leagues? Is that an important component? Because obviously working at the major league level, you're winning a lot of major league games. Is there emphasis put on that in the minor leagues?
Well, I think it's always there. You wake up every day if you're in low A, high A, double A, triple A, and your team's record is right there. At the end of the day, they're all competitors. So every night that they go to the ballpark, they're expecting to win and they're trying to win. And that's always the goal on a day-to-day basis, but not at the expense of developing their skill set for the major league level.
I mean, what drills are you seeing that you feel like translate the most to on-field performance?
So it can depend. I think it really does come down to what each individual player needs or what his weakness is. And, it's hard to say that there's a couple drills that really help because I think sometimes drills are being done just because they're drills, but it really needs to work off of like, what is what is the goal? What does this player need to do to get to the next level and working backwards off of that? Because I feel like a lot of times people are asking like, what drills should we do? It's like, well, what's the problem first, And I think that if you figure out what the problem is and then you start attacking those drills, you can then adjust what you're currently doing with those guys as well.
How do you focus on that piece? Okay, here's your weaknesses, but not at the expenses of losing their strengths.
Right. And so I think that's the thing I've probably learned over the years a lot too is weighing trade-offs and just looking at them. I think each situation is probably a little bit different. And so like, for example, if you're working with a catcher who struggles at the down and in fastball, but he's really good at the fastball down and away, if you feel like there are some little things you could clean up that will not take away from his positive receiving down and away, then go for it. But sometimes if you feel like, well, by him improving the down and in fastball, he's going to lose from the down and away, and most pitches are thrown down and away, it's probably not worth it to attack it that way. So I don't think all trade-offs are weighed equally. I don't think it's always 50-50. I think sometimes if it's 80-20, it might be worth the trade-off, or maybe it's such a small trade-off that the overall upside of the other area of it is well worth it.
How many minor leaguers now, once the season's done, get completely away from it and shut it completely down?
I think from a brief period of time, but I think if you shut it down for too long, it ends up hurting your abilities for your next season. So I think that there's a sweet spot somewhere in there, and sometimes from a physical and mental side of it, it is nice to give yourself a little bit of space because the season is so long. It's so redundant. But I also think that having an off day once a week that was implemented starting in the 2021 season kind of helps even within the season, feel not as grueling, especially for those leagues that have very, very difficult travel.
Yeah, I really liked the minor league schedule for those guys too, because they were someplace for 6 straight days. You get a day off, you're moving to the next place, or you're back home. Like I felt that was it's one of those things where like they should have been doing this a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it becomes a little tough for the players because they're facing the same team over and over again. But what I like about it is, from a strategy standpoint, you're facing the same relievers, or whoever you face on Tuesday, starting pitcher you're going to face on Sunday. So it's nice for the players to absolutely understand, trying to remember and recall certain tendencies from the last time they faced the player. That sometimes when you're only facing the team 3 times and you may not face them again the rest of the season, you don't necessarily naturally pick up that ability like the players do now.
Will you have any face-to-face time with the minor leaguers in the off season?
It depends. Sometimes we do some off-season clinics that are, can be optional for the players. Like we just did a 3-week strength camp where we brought down some of the players to West Palm Beach and, started doing some meetings with them, get them in the weight room the right way, and some on-field work as well. And so it just kind of depends. We communicate with them pretty regularly all throughout the off-season too.
And then when will it get kicked up for spring training for you?
Usually, the major league players will report, early to mid February. Some players like to start trickling in January and just start getting going down here in West Palm. So it kind of depends, but typically that's like the timeline. And sometimes we do some other camps and clinics in January. It just kind of depends on the year and the timing of everything.
And then do you have much crossover once the minor leaguers show up between the major league and the minor leagues?
A little bit. Our major league staff does a good job of bringing a lot of our minor league players over to the major league side for, maybe it's a couple practices or inside the games and getting them that exposure. That way when those guys get to that level, it doesn't seem as foreign. They're well known amongst the coaching staff and the other veteran players.
Once the season starts, how are you mixing in their training? Because they play a lot of games. I mean, they're playing 6 days a week. How are you able to mix the training piece in with the competitive side?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the specific level. So our AA level, for example, has a really difficult travel. A lot of their bus rides are a minimum of like 8 hours. So you can go different volumes of days based on travel, when the off day was, if it's a day game or a night game, and just kind of tracking their workload that way. And I think some of the technology we use helps us, from that standpoint, and also from maybe the last night's game, that these guys should be well rested today. But last night's game went 14 innings. What type of adjustments should we make on the next day's practice plan, and looking at it from that way. But I think the toughest part in the minor leagues is we don't have like the fall practice segment like in college where you can go through a ton of different practice variations and reps and intensities, where now we have to measure the intensity and the workload on the same day that they're playing a game that's, super important for their careers. And I think balancing that trade-off is very, unique and can be level dependent, can be player dependent, and all that way.
Will you keep guys out? Say the recovery level's not there. Will you guys keep people out of competition?
Yeah, we can if we really feel that like there's a huge discrepancy between it, or if we feel like okay, this guy is really kind of down the last couple of days, or maybe it's been a bunch of high scoring games and he's an outfielder and he's running all over the place. He's hit a bunch of doubles, stolen some bases. He might need his off day a little bit quicker than he would have the previous weeks. And I think sometimes it's balancing all right, the off day is, 4 days away. It's a day game the day before. and then there's a night game before that. So it's all kind of like a big puzzle that, that can maybe be, what's the best for this player, and a lot of our affiliates, we only have 11 or 12 players, position players. So it's also hard because you're not going to have a whole lot of bench guys to kind of put in there anyway. So there's so much to kind of weigh in those decisions, and I feel that our managers do a very good job with that.
I mean, how much information are you relaying to the minor league as far as opponents?
So it depends. I think as they go up the levels, you're starting to increase that amount of information, so that way they're not overwhelmed when they get to the major leagues. And some guys want more than others. Some guys, don't want as much. And I think sometimes it's weighing the differences. Maybe the guy who wants a ton of information is better off with no information. So I think it all kind of depends. And I think that's part of the art of coaching is understanding your players and what's probably best for them. But also making sure that you're preparing them the right way as well.
How long did it take you to figure that part out?
I think it changes every year. I think as the game evolves, players evolve and players' viewpoints change. And, I think that sometimes even from the time that the player goes from low A to triple A, he may have different viewpoints than he did from previous years. So I think that part is very individualized, and, players could start on one end of the spectrum with it and go all the way to the other where they're probably somewhere better in the middle. So it is interesting too to see how that can change over the years, especially compared to year one.
What does social media need to hear right now about coaching hitters or pitchers?
I think it needs to start with what's the problem. If the guy can't hit breaking balls, like what are you doing to not hit breaking balls? Or I think a lot of times it can be very technical heavy. And, I think a lot of those things can make huge impact. But at the end of the day, it's like working off of the problem first. And do we have accurate ways to actually measure what the problem is? So if it's a high school or youth team, almost charting like what exactly this player is struggling with. Because I think sometimes as coaches, we can get so emotional and we just remember the one or two really good things or one or two really bad things, and we start to just think that that's the weakness when really we've seen this guy have hundreds of at bats and we're really just kind of thinking about four of them.
What are some things that you've kept over the years that you've held on to
in terms of like just coaching in general?
Anything that you were doing early that you're still doing?
I think the first thing I think about is ways that I've probably changed. Like the first thing that comes to mind is really sitting down with the player and having more individualized meetings. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in an office. It could be during a BP in the outfield or such, and really trying to make sure that they understand what they need to do. And it's not me talking at them. It's more of me having the conversation with them. And I think sometimes it can just be like us asking them, like, what do you think that you need to do to get better? And just continuing to ask them questions over and over and over again until they get to a point where like you feel like you're on the same page, because I think that's going to promote the most ownership. And if they're only relying on you as the coach to tell them what they're doing right or wrong, they're probably not going to make the adjustments on their own quick enough. And if you're coaching 35 players and there's only a couple of coaches on staff, you need them to be self-efficient a lot of times. And so if they're just relying on you, they're not gonna get better as quickly.
I mean, what are some of the things that a coach maybe that's not doing that? Some of the conversations, is it, hey, how do you feel, or did you like that? I mean, is that some of the terminology maybe, or the questions that you're asking?
Yeah, I think it can depend on the personality, but sometimes people can be shy or are uncomfortable about it, or maybe players are just completely like into that mode that like the coach has to tell them what to do. So to break that, you can start with that, like, how have you been feeling in the box lately? How have you been feeling on the mounds? And they may say something as short as like, oh, I've been okay, I've been good, or not good, and then you just continue to ask them a question over and over and over and over again. And if you have a direction of where you want to go with it, you just ask them questions that are going to lead them to the water that way. And I think that will continue to help get them to self-reflect, and then I think once they have the awareness to it, they can then hold themselves accountable to understand that.
I mean, how do you help your introverted players kind of get out of their comfort zone?
Right. Yeah. And and that's where it's tough, and that's where I think like the setting of that type of conversation can be very important, and the way that you go about that. And I think that that's the art of coaching. I think that's why coaches matter. It's why no matter how many numbers or data sets we have, coaching's still always going to be top dog. And I think that that's part of us as coaches that we have to realize what's the best way to do that for each guy. And I think one thing I've learned over the years too is you have to, like we always say, like you have to show them how much you care first. But I don't always think that that's possible. I think sometimes that can take a long time, and players need to get better before you can get to that standpoint. Or maybe players don't really care right away if you care about them. They just want to get better on the first day of practice. And so I think that sometimes you got to view it like you're always working against time. And certain players are going to be harder to coach than others, and how you go about that can be very individualized. But if you're only waiting around to coach them once you feel like you've gained their full respect, that might take a lot of time, and throughout that time
you may never get there.
You
still got to coach them. You may never get there.
Yeah, players change teams a lot. They some of them need to get better quicker, and I think it's a balance of like before you get to that level of like a relationship with them, what are you doing until then? And I think I learned that from being the short season manager, where you're getting the players, and then the next day you're like playing a game, and then a week later these guys are already struggling, and they're like looking at you for like, how can you help me? And it's like, I don't know, I've known you for a week, so it just really makes you think like you can still make impact while you're building relationships. And I think that that's maybe something that can be overlooked at times, based on some cliche lines that we've kind of stuck to in the past.
Was Dylan Lawson a big reason why you went to the Astros?
I knew Dylan a little bit before the Astros, but not a whole lot. I actually remember his ABCA speech on Sunday when he was at
in Orlando.
In Orlando at SEMO. And my good friend Matt Borgschulte was telling me like, "Hey man, you got to watch this one." And I remember that presentation a lot. And that kind of like made me think about like training hitters a lot differently. That was awesome. And I've obviously gotten to build a strong relationship with both of them over the years. So I go back to that as my first kind of reference to Dylan.
Yeah. Well, because you and Borgie both played for RC, right? Ryan Connors at Parkway.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we played in high school together at Parkway Central, and then we played in summer ball for the St. Louis Pirates with Rick Strickland together as well.
Yeah, RC needs to get back in the game. RC, if you're listening, you need to get back into coaching. Back in Evansville, he's a counselor at Plaza Park in Evansville. He needs to get back into coaching. I remind him of that all the time. So, any other coaches you want to give a shout out to? Like anybody else kind of helped you along the way?
Oh man, there's so many. I think the first person that hired me was Rob Smith. And I think one thing that I learned from him right away that was very interesting. Ohio University was coming off of a rough season, and he had just taken over the program. But, I've never seen such an established good coach become so vulnerable. And, we actually went on a little trip in like a cabin where there was no cell phone service for a whole weekend. And, as a program, we wanted to talk about every possible area of development that we could think of. And we wanted to poke holes and debate every topic. And, looking back to my coaching journey, that was probably one of the more powerful things that I've been a part of, that I probably didn't really realize at the time. And it just really made me think about things to the depths before you try to implement them. And that was like a really awesome experience just to watch, a bunch of successful coaches become so vulnerable. And, it ended up kind of helped shape the program the next year. And we had a lot of success. And I go back to that time period. But yeah, Rob was the first person that hired me. There's so many people inside the Astros organization that I could give a shout out to. But Pete Putila, the now GM of the Giants, would be another one. He always just was, it didn't matter what role you had in the organization your first year, your last year. It's like if you have an idea that could add value, bring it forward, and we're going to have an environment that allows that. And if it's going to help us be successful, we'll implement it tomorrow. And so it's been just a cool experience to see how quickly things like that can reshape the development of players.
And I agree with you on that. But as a coach, when it's ego driven a little bit, it's hard because you want it all to work. I mean, how do you get over that? That okay, we're going to try something new here. It may not work, but we're going to try it anyway.
Yeah, I think a lot of times it comes down to the areas that we don't have answers to. And if we feel like we're doing some things that aren't having that much of an impact, what's really the risk? What's the trade off here? And the same thing when we look at like trade offs in different skill development with players, it could even be different things that we implement. So if we're trying to implement a new piece of technology, maybe picking the right player or the right person that's going to like give it the right effort, and just kind of explaining up front, hey, like this is what we're thinking. We're trying to get better answers to this problem, and we don't know how this is going to turn out. So and just kind of giving an opening like that, I think can be beneficial depending on exactly what it is. And I think from there it can help lead to better outcomes all across the organization or all across the future. But at the end of the day, if you're not experimenting with new ideas, it's hard to feel like you're growing.
You 2 years at SLU, and then you go to Central Missouri. What was the impetus for, okay, I need to go to Central?
I think both programs were in the midst of having a lot of success, and it was cool just to see two completely different styles of success and how they go about development. And, I felt like once I got into the coaching world, even though all I had done was been a college player, I felt like, I've seen multiple styles that work. Like, what's my style? What do I feel like is the best way to go about it? And I felt like those two programs kind of helped shape me a lot as a coach in terms of my viewpoints on development.
I mean, how long did it take you to find your voice when you first got into coaching?
I don't know. I think it kind of depends. I think once I finally was like coaching my own group of players, I was just, all right, that didn't sound good. Or, there's just a lot of reflection that goes in. But, I felt like when I was first, going through the volunteer opportunities, it's harder to feel like you're having that type of voice because you're generally assisting a lot of other coaches for a lot of it. And so I think once I, was moving programs to places where I'm controlling the pitching staff or all of the recruiting, I felt like then I was able to get comfortable with my coaching voice more. And I think even like coaching and doing a lot of lessons was really helpful for me early on because, I was doing lessons from kids who were age like 4 through, college. And so I felt like my voice was being developed because I had to simplify things as much as possible for a 4-year-old, that like maybe you can take some of those concepts and apply them to a 24-year-old. So I think that over the years, just the constant progressions in that, I think working a ton of different camps was super helpful because, when you're working a camp with hundreds of kids, you're kind of coaching everything. And so I think you're kind of forced into this environment to lead some drills and different things going on in the field that kind of put you in a zone where you have to be as efficient as possible with how you speak to a complete group of strangers and overall.
And I think we all went through that as young coaches. Like, okay, you're the volunteer coach, and you may not be getting some of the responsibility that you feel like you should get. I mean, how do you get over that? Because you need to transition at some point, and you also need to understand that, okay, I'm not going to get everything thrown on my plate right now that I probably want. So how do you handle that?
I think if you just maximize what you're currently doing, like you can gain respect. So for me, a lot of it was the operations. I wanted to be the best at like scheduling the right meals and hotels and the buses. And then as you do that, a lot of times you can show to the head coach that you're reliable. And I think once you can prove that to them, a lot of them are able to start to dish out some more responsibilities for you. And I think that it starts with just maximizing what you're currently doing rather than only looking ahead to what you want to do.
Yes. Yep, for sure. For sure. Be really good at the responsibilities that you have, and you'll get more after that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have a fail forward moment? Do you have something you thought was going to sidetrack you, but looking back now is one of the best things that happened to you?
Gotta think about that.
Everybody's got to answer that one. That's the one. That's the one everybody has to answer.
Yeah, man. There's probably so many.
It could be life journey, could be coaching. Doesn't necessarily have to be a coaching deal. It could be a life journey piece that
Yeah, I think going back to the Tommy John example that we used earlier is probably when I think of like the order of operations. That's probably one that comes to mind because I felt like after that first practice, I could have just sat there and been like, I'm just gonna get through it for this next year, and then once I come back, I'll attack it. But I think from the coaching standpoint, that really kind of that first practice and moving forward and such kind of really helps me evolve my viewpoints and thoughts as a coach. And I think that would probably be the first thing that comes to mind. And when I think about a certain time that maybe reshaped the future.
When you're forced to sit and watch for a little bit, just things become a little bit more clear when you're forced to actually just sit and watch for a while.
Yeah, especially when you're not like emotionally as like attached and involved in it, to where you have all these biases. And I think then it just gives you like just such a different lens to view it from. And I think that kind of helps me now and like kind of take a step back at times and think like, all right, am I being a little too over the top about this, or not enough, or like, is this lens like, the best way to view it from? And I think what that has done is kind of helped me before I make, bigger decisions, really try to understand, as many viewpoints as possible that I don't have blinders to, and try to knock down the blinders that I do have to help produce the best outcome.
I mean, what are your set routines, either morning or evening? You guys have a grind of a schedule. What are some of the routines that you use that you feel like help you?
It depends on the time of the year. In the summer, it seems like there's always kind of something going on all throughout the day, just because of different time zones. And the Dominican Summer League, they start so much earlier just because of the rain, and they may be starting their games at 10:30, where maybe the AAA team is just played a night game the night before in Sacramento, so they're finishing at 2 a.m. So I think it kind of depends, but generally I kind of wake up and just kind of first I start with make my bed every day. That's always like kind of a given that I do.
Mine
But
too.
yeah, no matter what, just got to find a way. Even when you're in a hurry, it's really only taking an extra minute. But I think it starts there, and then kind of just recapping and reviewing the previous day and everything, and kind of having some to-do lists from the night before of what I want to attack first. I've tried it in a few different ways. I used to make that to-do list right when I woke up, and I felt like, okay, that's step number one, knocked it out. But I felt like I wasn't as clear-minded at that point of, oh man, like yesterday I felt like there was something else I needed to add to this list. So a lot of times I like to do that the night before, maybe right before bed. Kind of make that list and start just kind of attacking them based on priority. And, I think one thing I've learned over the years too is like how to reevaluate your time. So when you do go to bed and you're reflecting on the day and you're looking at your list, was what you did, what percentage of that is actually going to help produce the best outcome? Because there's a lot of things that everybody can have on their to-do list. Let's say that there's 10 things a day, but not all 10 things can be created equal. And, maybe you prioritize which one you attack first, but from the time allocation standpoint, did you feel like you allocated time that was going to make the biggest impact, or, were you just spreading out that time evenly? And I think I've probably improved the most on that, because I think I used to probably spend way too much time organizing things that were already fairly organized just because I wanted to iron out every detail. But at the expense of that, I was kind of missing the big picture of things.
I'll throw more stuff because I still use Sunday as like try to set up the whole week, but
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like my to-do list. It's like everything that I'm trying to get done for the week is in that Monday, and then I'll kind of shift it to different days. And okay, this is important. I need to do this today, and I have to get that cranked out. The rest of this stuff I can shift it to later on, and it kind of filters out through the week. So I end up getting everything done. It gives me a little bit more flexibility with how I can manage my time.
Yeah, I look at it as like a tiering system. If you do that on a Sunday, what are like the objectives for the week? What are like the big ticket items that you need to attack? And then what are these next tier where like they're maybe not as important, but like they have to get done no matter what? And then what's like the third tier of, like I need to get to these, but like if I don't, it won't be the end of the world if these other items take a little bit more time. And I try to look at it from the tiering system as well to kind of help me with all my jumbled big to-do list.
What has been your favorite convention?
Honestly, I think probably that first one, just because I was brand new to coaching. It was like, one of my first opportunities to really feel like I could just have so many different side conversations. I think that I didn't even know anything about hot stoves until I arrived. And, just watching some very intelligent people debate some topics that we don't have clear answers to kind of made me think a lot differently about my own viewpoints and how I want to evolve them, or at what point do I give in to my beliefs and change and adjust them. So I will always go back to my first one of that, and just how much it just kind of reshaped the way that I view coaching.
What are some other resources that you're using that you like?
Um, I listen to a ton of podcasts. I would say I'm a big podcaster. The Huberman Lab podcast is
Love
probably
it.
the one that I listen to the
Love
most.
it.
I mean that one they're so intense that sometimes I have to re-listen to a lot of them to feel like I gauged enough of the ideas going around. That's probably number one. I think.
Hey, what have you liked about the Huberman Lab podcast? Because I have my own thoughts about why I like it, but what have you enjoyed about it?
I think my favorite one he ever did was probably in the summer of 2021 about skill development and kind of how our brains evolve through skill, and just like some of the research that some things that I hadn't really thought about. One example would be like visualization. He was talking about how our brains can work in reverse, just kind of like how dreams do. So maybe sometimes the visualization after the event could be help you like digest what just happened. I thought that was like super fascinating, and there's a lot of research behind that I was completely unaware of. But I like how he has a lot of research and data backed up inside of his own beliefs before he's ever going to put it on his podcast. And so I think it can be jam packed with an overwhelming amount of information, but I think that at the end of the day, it's like really scientific, which is something that I'm completely in enjoyment about. But I would say another resource, like honestly, with the people that I work with, every day that I go to work, I feel like I feel like I'm one of the dumbest people that are around. So I always have liked that because I can ask a ton of different questions that may be obvious to some, but not always to myself. And so I think just utilizing the people that that are advanced in that area and debating questions, and not being afraid to be someone to ask a stupid question. And I don't know, I have a lot of phone conversations with people with completely different viewpoints of myself that I respect, and want to see if I can take their viewpoint into my form of sorts to always evolve myself.
I'm not scared to ask multiple questions, even if they're dumb. Like it helps me. I think out loud, and so it helps me ask questions. Usually, I come to a solution by asking questions. So I'm never scared to be like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what anybody's going to think. I'll just ask it because usually I'm trying
Yeah.
to work through trying to get to a solution by asking questions.
Yeah, and I think that's like I think I've always been a big question asker, but I think over the years, I think I've started to really realize the importance behind that. Like even with players, instead of like feeling like you're talking at them, it's more conversational. And I just think like the value of asking questions just can generate so many more thoughts, and it can be a lot of times less attacking when you're debating a topic with somebody that's maybe super passionate about their viewpoint. If you just ask them a simple question that's maybe like hinting at something that's different, it's maybe less offensive to them on the feeling of it. And I think it's a lot of times that way you can have like a healthier debate of certain topics too.
I mean, what percentage of your players are visualizing or using some form of visualization?
It's probably tough to say because I don't exactly see it's not maybe as organized in a group setting. But I would say the majority of them do some sort of visualization on their own. Maybe it's before they even arrive to the ballpark or afterwards. But I think that area has continued to grow and improve. It's sometimes hard to sell certain people on ideas that you don't have a whole lot of evidence behind. So you just have to know a little bit of like, all right, is the juice worth the squeeze with this person on this topic? Because we don't have a whole lot of way of measuring that this is impacting or not impacting. But I think that creating some sort of routine for each person can help set them up for success.
With after action reviews or in the season, like, okay, here's how the game went. Are you covering that individually with teams in a team setting, individual setting? How are you covering that with them?
So it's a combination. We do a lot of video game reviews for the players, which I like, where the manager will lead it. He'll make a list throughout the game, and we'll have a bunch of camera angles, and it could be a lot of baseball IQ. Things that you're touching on, especially base running and certain things that are really hard to feel like they're instinctual in the game, even though that players may know what they need to do with when they're at second base with nobody out, but then in the game they don't do it. And so it's just like I think a lot of those conversations can spur a lot of the smaller elements of the game that are super big. So they may only get one or two chances in a month at that opportunity at second base with nobody out and that read, but it's something that can really impact the game. And so I think we do a very good job, our managers, of kind of leading those discussions. And I think it's been cool to see how it's evolved, where it used to just be like, this was my fault and an adjustment that I've had, when I first started as a manager. I loved leading those meetings and like talking to them and pointing out all these examples. And, as the season went on, as a manager, I turned it into more questions, or like, what do you think I'm pointing out in this play? Like, what do you guys remember from 2 nights ago? And then at the end of the year, I felt like our team was on it enough where I had another player lead it, and I just sat in the audience. I actually videoed the whole thing, and it was fun because they're making fun of my style of how I go about those meetings. And it's fun because Jeremy Pena was one of the guys leading that meeting, and they would kind of pass it off to the next guy, and it was kind of fun to see them kind of to mimic me in a way to where it was like creating like a fun environment that was at the end of the day still getting the baseball IQ and base running elements that we wanted to talk about. But from the team setting, that's how it goes. Individually, we do a ton of that. It's not necessarily as formal as how often we do it. Some players want to come in every day and have some sort of meeting. Some guys would rather just do them once a week or once a month. So it kind of depends individually based on each individual. And sometimes when guys are just having a ton of success, you can just leave them be in some of those areas if they're on a roll.
I think as a coach, once your players are comfortable enough to start mimicking you, I think you should take that as a compliment, because it means they're actually comfortable with you and they feel like they have a relationship built. I know some people are like, well, they're being they're not. Like, they're this generation, they're like, if they're going to be willing to open themselves up and do that and mimic you, like, it means that you got them, like you have a good relationship with them.
For sure. And I do a lot of videoing in general. Like I pay for all the extra storage, and some of my videos are just of somebody's pre-pitch in the outfield that's 4 seconds. So I have like 8,000 videos on my phone. But sometimes what I think I realized when I first started coaching is I used to hate hearing my own voice until I started to realize like how impactful that could be for the development of my coaching voice, And so I started to get comfortable with just like what I sound like and, how I go about, explaining different things. And it kind of helped me coach myself, because I think the hardest part as a coach is there's no OPS to how you're performing a lot of times. A lot of times the win-loss doesn't give the full picture of it. And there's not always somebody that's going to be right over there coaching you on how to coach. And so I think that, self-awareness and accountability yourself is such an important dynamic. And sometimes it's by mistake that I'm maybe filming a drill of a player and I end up hearing my own voice. But sometimes you can set it up to where, if you want to really improve your ability to speak to the team as a group, if you set up a video and kind of reflect it in a way where you don't then become robotic, but in a way where you can help become more efficient and more clear while being authentic. And, I think that's kind of helped me evolve over the years.
What are some final thoughts, or something I should have asked you that I didn't?
I think as simple as this is, like really looking at the big picture for each player. We can make a big deal about, what they're doing in the stretch routine and things that maybe do matter, but at what expense? At the end of the day, if it's a position player and it's hitting, lifting, pitching, if you're the head coach or you're the leader of the team, how much are you driving home the S&C side? Can you be the one leading the meeting with the strength and conditioning coach about, that dynamic? Because a lot of times the players feel like they have a closer relationship with the baseball coach of it. So, can that person help support it instead of just like kind of pushing the player over to the strength and conditioning coach? Can he be the one leading the meeting, helping drive and support the S&C side, and really kind of looking at everything from that perspective? And like, at the end of each day, did we feel like this specific player got better on the S&C side, the hitting side, and the defensive side? And if we felt like we maybe allocated too much time to how organized the throwing program might have been, or can we be a little bit more flexible with the things that maybe look more professional to the eye, at the expense of improving the overall player's skill set? And I think of that inside of Mass Fungo. If one player needs to work on his forehand, the other one needs to work on the backhand. Why are they getting the same amount of reps inside their Mass Fungo? Can you personalize ground balls even inside of their own Mass ground ball situation? And really just going to the depths of individualized development inside of a big team setting. And at the end of the day, kind of reflecting back on just the simplified way, hitting, lifting, and defense. Like, did we feel like we accomplished what we needed to there at the end of the day?
Well, and that's a Hawkeye piece, too, from a positioning standpoint. You get all that information, whether somebody's good to their left, they're good to their right. That's the cool thing with the tech now is you can see all the inefficiencies and you can see their strengths. It just makes it easier to coach that now.
For sure. And I think even for those who don't have access to that information, if you have some sort of charting system that could help you, or even from what you see inside of the Mass Fungo, where are they making most of the errors, or where are they not getting the ball over to first base in a timely manner? And you can then always kind of work backwards off of what you're trying to produce. So, for example, if you're a coach and you don't have a lot of defensive information, what can you do to get defensive information? What type of charting system can you set up that kind of help you evaluate the defender first? And what type of competitions with beating the clock over to first base and things can you set up that help you understand what the true weakness is of the player? And I think working backwards off of that in each area, like we were talking earlier with like the guy struggles hitting breaking balls, but I think a lot of times we end up just doing drills to do drills that don't necessarily, impact the player to his specific needs, because I think sometimes it's hard for us to know the needs. And so I think that a lot of times it starts with like creating some sort of system that helps us understand what the needs really are.
Had a shortstop one year, was really good to his left, could not backhand, so we allowed him to just play closer to the hole just to allow more balls for him to be able to move to his left on. And that was maybe something that you look
Right.
at and be like, well, you shouldn't be doing that. I'm like, well, he's not going to make that backhand play, so we need to move him over to allow him to be comfortable. And he eventually got better at the backhand, but I'm like, all right, let's just put a Band-Aid on it, let him play over where he's comfortable, and he'll make more plays doing it that way.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. I think maximizing what each player has inside of the weaknesses and the strengths.
Yep. All right, Jason, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan.